By around 3100 BC, Europe is no longer a patchwork of isolated local traditions. The map still looks diverse, but something has changed. Across the continent, communities are building bigger, lasting longer, and connecting farther. Some places become landscapes of memory, fixed points that draw people back for centuries. Others become network worlds where distance collapses through exchange and shared styles. And in a few regions, power begins to leave clearer fingerprints in space and in goods. In the Atlantic zone, organization is written in stone. Ireland's Passage Tomb tradition is already part of this story, but the wider British Isles show how monument landscapes can expand into entire regions of gathering and return. Further north, in Orkney, long-term investment becomes concentrated into a dense landscape of monuments and large stone buildings. Stone-built architecture persists over long spans, reinforced, rebuilt, and maintained. Standing stone rings, formal spaces, and large built structures cluster close enough to suggest repeated assembly within the same small geography. When multiple monumental sites share one landscape, people are being drawn toward a center again and again. In southern Britain, persistence takes another form. Stonehenge begins early as earthworks, around 3100 BC, establishing a place as significant. Centuries pass and the monument changes form, but the location stays active. Nearby, the wider Wessex landscape reads like a ritual zone built around movement and return. At Durrington Walls, large settlement traces and feasting evidence have been linked to seasonal gatherings around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Across the British Isles, the monuments are fixed points in time and geography. They anchor movement, gathering, and tradition in specific places. But not every signature of the 3rd millennium is fixed in stone. Across the continent, connection also shows up as patterns that spread. Across large parts of Europe, archaeologists identify broad horizons, packages of material culture, and burial practices that appear over huge distances. They form recognizable patterns across the 3rd millennium BC, even as local variation remains strong. One of the largest is the Corded Ware Horizon, broadly dated to roughly 3000 to 2350 BC. From the North European plain through the Vistula Basin and into the Carpathian fringes, burials and material styles repeat with regional differences, suggesting connections far beyond any single valley. Then the bell beaker phenomenon spreads across the map, beginning around 2800 BC. In Iberia and parts of western France, it can appear first and foremost as pottery and drinking sets. Farther north, including Britain and the lower Rhine zone, it is often associated with single burials and a recognizable prestige toolkit, sometimes including archery equipment and early metal objects. What matters is acceleration. Shared markers appear across very large spaces, and overlap implies interaction, meeting, exchange, intermarriage, migration, imitation, and competition. Stone, copper, and new prestige objects do not replace each other overnight. They overlap, and they can remain meaningful side by side for centuries. One of the most vivid examples of prestige traveling across distance is not metal at all. In parts of France, specialist flint sources become famous for producing long blades shaped into daggers, objects made as much for display as for use. Grand Pressigny flint from central France appears far beyond its source region, carried into burials, and exchanged across networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. For a time, these imports and their local imitations peak even as copper becomes more common, showing that older prestige technologies can persist alongside new ones. And when objects move that far, they often follow the easiest paths. In the ancient world, many of those paths are rivers. The Danube corridor links the continental interior to the Black Sea, and in the 3rd millennium BC, it becomes a route where connections can be repeated and routine. Along its banks, communities are not only farming, they are meeting, trading, and absorbing ideas that travel with traffic on the river. Near modern Vukovar, the site of Vučedol anchors one of the clearest Danube world signatures of the period. Between roughly 3000 and 2200 BC, this zone shows a dense cultural footprint linked to settlement life and metallurgy, where access to movement and materials can amplify influence beyond a single local landscape. East of the river mouth, the shoreline becomes a belt of interaction rather than an edge. Along the northwestern Black Sea coast and the steppe-adjacent zones, farming regions, river mouths, and open grassland worlds overlap. The record preserves exchange, shifting boundaries, and contacts that move with routes and seasons. Near the northwestern Black Sea, the Usatov complex sits close to the meeting point of inland waterways and the coastal zone. Its material record belongs to a landscape shaped by multiple directions of connection, up the rivers, along the shore, and into the steppe beyond. Farther east and north, the open steppe leaves a different signature: kurgans. Across the Pontic-Caspian grasslands, communities grouped under the Yamnaya horizon, roughly 3,300 to 2,600 BC, raise burial mounds over pit graves, marking movement routes and grazing zones across enormous distances. South of the steppe, the North Caucasus adds another layer. The Maikop kurgan, earlier in the 4th millennium BC, is famous because it shows how rich and far-connected elite burials could be in the steppe Caucasus sphere, and how long-distance prestige exchange reaches deep into the continent's eastern networks. From the lower Danube to the northwestern Black Sea and onward into the open steppe, Europe's eastern edge becomes a zone where contact is constant. If the Black Sea edge is a corridor of overlap, the North Sea has its own coherent sphere, shaped by different coasts and different rhythms. In Scandinavia, a distinctive northern sphere takes shape in the 3rd millennium BC. Archaeologists often group parts of this record under the battle axe variant, broadly dated to around 2800 to 2300 BC. The signature is clearest in burials and the objects placed with them: stone battle axes, characteristic pottery, and repeated burial choices that mark identity in ways others can recognize. Across southern and central Sweden, including regions like Skåne and Uppland, these practices appear again and again, suggesting a coherent cultural world forming around the Baltic and the North Sea edges. The North is not isolated. It is part of the wider European transformation of the 3rd millennium, even when its signals remain strongly regional and distinct. In Episode 1, Los Millares gave us one clear image of Copper Age complexity in Iberia. But the 3rd millennium BC landscape is broader than any single fortified settlement. Near the lower Guadalquivir, the Valencina de la Concepción area grows into one of the largest Copper Age aggregation zones in Western Europe, with activity commonly placed in the range of 3,200 to 2,300 BC. The scale points to a regional center of gathering, craft, and burial, more than a local village world. Farther west, in the Alentejo, Perdigones is a ditched enclosure complex with a long span that includes the third millennium, built for repeated gatherings and structured use over time. Along the Atlantic-facing zones, fortified sequences such as Zambujal show investment in walls, controlled access, and settlement persistence across centuries. Here, copper matters not only because it exists, but because it implies systems. Mining, knowledge, production, and distribution leave durable traces, and settlement and mortuary evidence make social differentiation increasingly visible across the Iberian map. From Iberia, the Western Mediterranean feels less like a boundary and more like a continuation of connected shorelines. On Sardinia, the Monte Claro horizon, broadly dated to about 2,400 to 2,100 BC, marks a late third millennium island world with its own coherent material signature. At Monte da Codi near Sassari, a stepped platform monument stands out in the landscape, planned construction tied to repeated use and long-lived significance. From island nodes like this, the Western Mediterranean opens naturally into the Italian peninsula. Across Italy, Copper Age communities leave a record that is both regional and connected, visible in burials, settlements, and the spread of metal objects. In the north, the Remedello tradition, broadly dated to about 3,400 to 2,400 BC, is often linked to distinctive burial assemblages, where copper daggers and other objects can appear as clear status signals. Farther south, in central Italy, the Rinaldone tradition runs through much of the third millennium, with a commonly cited span reaching toward 2,100 BC. Burial evidence preserves regional identities that persist for centuries, while still participating in wider networks of exchange and influence. And above these regions, the Alps add the production layer behind the objects. Copper begins as ore in specific upland zones, and extraction and processing leave archaeological footprints that link mountains to lowlands long before any formal urban centers appear. By the late 3rd millennium BC, Europe shows multiple paths of complexity running in parallel. Monument landscapes, long-distance networks, and Copper Age hubs each shape the map in different ways. Where power begins to leave fingerprints, the material record clusters around control of space and goods. Walls and gateways, central buildings and storage, specialized production zones, seals and ceilings, planned rebuilding, and inequality expressed through architecture, burial, and prestige objects. These clusters do not appear everywhere at once, but where they do appear, the pattern becomes sharper. In the Aegean, sea lanes connect islands, coasts, and corridors into one field of movement. In the Cyclades, from about 3,100 BC onward, communities are linked by roots, exchange, and shared styles. Settlements, cemeteries, and distinctive objects echo one another from island to island, even when each community remains independent. Some of the clearest signals are the materials that must travel. On Melos, obsidian is extracted from outcrops such as St. Nikia and Demenagaki. That volcanic glass appears widely across the Aegean, evidence of repeated sea crossings and dependable exchange. At Philokopi on Melos, obsidian working inside the settlement shows that networks are also skills and workshops, not only raw material in motion. Farther east, Keros shows another face of Cycladic connectivity. At Kavos and the nearby islet of Daskalio, large deposits of broken figurines and other objects suggest repeated visits and shared ritual behavior. Major activity here clusters in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, around 2750 to 2550 BC. On Ios, Skarkos preserves a large Cycladic town plan with tightly packed architecture. Its main occupation belongs to early Cycladic II and ends around the middle of the 3rd millennium, roughly 2550 to 2500 BC. On Syros, at Castri, near Chalandriani, fortification and defended placement become more prominent toward the later 3rd millennium. The Castri phase is often placed around 2500 to 2300 BC, showing that even within the Cyclades, the balance between open connectivity and defended space can shift over time. Routes here are rarely straight lines across open sea. They are chains of short jumps between familiar harbors and visible horizons, a maritime logic that shapes the wider Aegean world. On mainland Greece, parts of the early Helladic world show unusually large buildings and more structured settlement space. At Lerna in the Argolid, the House of the Tiles, dated to early Helladic II, around 2500 to 2300 BC, stands out as something beyond a household-scale structure, tied to community-level function, storage, authority, or coordination. Clay ceilings, used to secure containers or doors, suggest repeated acts of marking and managing goods movement, not writing but routine control, becoming more visible when distribution and storage matter. Across the water on the Aegean side of Anatolia, the coastline forms a corridor of harbors, plains, and passes. In the 3rd millennium BC, that corridor already holds defended nodes where movement can be channeled and exchange routes converge. Troy in the Troad is one of the most famous of these nodes. Its early Bronze Age phases include substantial fortifications, and Troy II is often placed around 2550 to 2300 BC, a long occupation span in a position that rewards control of movement between the Aegean and the routes leading toward the Black Sea. Within the Aegean itself, Crete is already moving along a trajectory that later becomes unmistakable. In the 3rd millennium BC, the foundations are visible through expanding settlements, craft specialization, and growing exchange. It is a pre-palatial world, complex in its own right, accumulating the conditions that make later administrative forms possible. By the late 3rd millennium BC, Europe shows multiple paths of development running in parallel. Monument landscapes, horizon networks, prestige objects, Copper Age hubs, river systems, and coastal nodes all shape the map. In a few regions, the organization of space and goods becomes more tightly structured, leaving clearer traces of control in the archaeological record. The threshold is close, not as a single moment, but as a gradual clustering of patterns that in some regions will soon change form.